Buenos dias. Welcome, everybody. We're just about to start our program. Uh, Bienvenidos todos. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us this morning. This day-long symposium revealing ancestral Central America is a really special program for us, and it's part of a much larger project that I'm going to explain to you a little bit before welcoming our first speaker. My name is Randall Woodeman. I'm the Exhibitions and Public Programs Director at the Smithsonian Latino Center, and I want to especially welcome all our online audience who will be viewing us today through the internet. Um, Today's program is just one in a series of public programs which actually started in 2010 to highlight Central American heritage, to help to tell a complex story that is both ancient and which also resounds into the present. The story of El Salvador, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama, and other countries in this region are very much intertwined with the history of U.S. empire, agribusiness, immigration, and, of course, archaeology. The exhibition upstairs, which hopefully all of you have seen already, or if not, we have a long lunch break, so you can check it out then, is at the center of this entire initiative, and that exhibit is called Cerámica de los Ancestros, Central America's Past Revealed. It's part of a collaboration between my office, the Smithsonian Latino Center, and the National Museum of the American Indian. And it's an effort to engage not just scholarly audiences like yourselves, but also the immediate heirs of the legacy of material culture, Los Centroamericanos, who, by the way, number in the hundreds of thousands and are just here in the Smithsonian's own backyard. Not to mention that Central Americans, of course, comprise one of the largest Latino communities nationally. So this exhibit is about their heritage. That's why we're calling it Cerámica de los Ancestros. And you can see this exhibit again upstairs, and it's on view through February 1st, 2015. So this exhibition and today's symposium are part of an effort to start a conversation, not just about archaeology, but about identity and national histories. Speaking from the perspective of the Smithsonian Latino Center, we wondered what kinds of questions these objects might provoke for, say, a second-generation Salvadoran American kid who hasn't had a chance to go back home. Now, does our sense of personal history of Latinos start only when we migrate to this country? Or as Salvadorans or other Latin Americans, does our history start at the time of Spanish conquest? Or can we lay claim to a much older history, one that has often been erased, and align our sense of history with the history of indigenous peoples? Indeed, my unit, the Smithsonian Latino Center, collaborates significantly with this museum with the understanding that Latinos are informed by the culture and history of indigenous peoples, both in the past and in the present. However, we also acknowledge that our construction of Latinidad or Latino-ness isn't something that Native peoples from Latin America would want to adopt for themselves. But our collaboration between the Latino Center and NMAI, this museum, has its roots in the belief that this museum has objects in its collection that tell Latino stories, objects that speak to our history and sense of place and origin. So today we're going to have a dynamic and, dare I say, exciting symposium. As many of you know, it carries the same title as our publication, Revealing Ancestral Central America, which all of you will get at some point today. If you reserved a copy by email, you can pick it up, your copy anytime before 2:15. If you didn't reserve a copy of this book, you can pick it up during the 2:15 break at the table outside. Please note that this book and a bilingual children's coloring book are available for free download online, and there's a slide here that has that web address, or just grab me at any point and I will repeat it to you. I'd like to thank Anne McMullen, the exhibition's lead curator, who was critical in organizing the publication. I also want to acknowledge Alex Benitez, our guest curator. Both of them contributed to the publication with short essays on the history of the Central American archaeological collection here at NMAI, and contributed significantly to our last symposium, 2011, titled Collecting Ancient Central America, Museums, Explorers, and Archaeologists in Pursuit of the Past. Now, speaking of symposia, I want to welcome the members of the Pre-Columbian Society of Washington, D.C., who just held their annual symposium yesterday. I also need to acknowledge that funding for this event came from the Latino Initiatives Pool, which is administered by the Smithsonian Latino Center. These are your U.S. tax dollars at work, paying really for all of this. I also want to thank Elizabeth Kennedy Gish, our event volunteers, and all the audio, web, and other support staff supporting this event. Thank you, guys. All of us will remind you to make sure to silence your cell phone, so please do that now. Today's program is divided in two parts. The morning sessions are by Rosemary Joyce and John Hoops, and these are dedicated to archaeology and the interpretation of Central America's ancestral past. Each of these sessions is 45 minutes long, with 15 minutes at the end of each talk dedicated to audience questions and comments. I'd like to acknowledge Laura Wingfield from Emory University, who will be the respondent to both of these talks and who will kick off the Q&A. There will not be a break between the first two talks, but I will come back on stage to introduce John and read you his bio before he starts his presentation. After lunch, we will focus on contemporary heritage and the preservation of patrimony. I encourage all of you to participate in the Q&A, but please remember to be brief and succinct in your comments and questions. I'll have to police you a little bit on that because we really have a tight schedule today. So, Rosemary Joyce is our first speaker. She has been an ally of this project from the very beginning and did an amazing service to us as an editor for our publication revealing ancestral Central America. Rosemary Joyce is a professor of anthropology and former chair of the anthropology department at the University of California at Berkeley. She's one of the world's leading experts on Honduran archaeology and once served as assistant director to the Peabody Museum at Harvard University and director of the Hearst Museum at Berkeley. She has served as an officer of the Archaeology Division of the American Anthropological Association, on committees for the Society for American Archaeology and the Archaeological Institute of America, and is a member of the Society for Historical Archaeology. Her research includes comparative studies of collections of Honduran archaeological materials and museums in Europe, the United States, and Central America, and historical research on the origin of museums and the systematic collecting of objects beginning in the 16th century. Please let's welcome Rosemary Joyce. And let's pull up.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'd like to start by thanking both the National Museum of the American Indian and the Smithsonian Latino Center for the opportunity to work with them on a project that is actually bringing to greater attention a region that really has not been the focus of public exhibition in the United States as a whole, although we can point to specific exhibitions about Costa Rica. So talking about Central America then is something that's very important, and what I hope this talk that I'm going to present today will do is give you an idea of what you can discover about the past through archaeological research on Central America. También quiero que pedir disculpas de toda la gente de idioma español, porque esta ponencia va a ser completamente en inglés, pero si hay preguntas que quieren que preguntar en español, sería muy factible de hacerlo. So, when we look at a map of Central America with the modern national boundaries, from a perspective of anybody who might come from a Honduran or Salvadoran or Nicaraguan background, the question of archaeology is a question of national pasts in place. For an archaeologist looking at the same region, there's a temptation to talk about the region in relationship to Mesoamerica to the north or the Andean region to the south. What I want to do today instead is to dissolve the national boundaries and to talk about some of the kinds of themes that might come out of looking at Central American archaeology, not in this very highly removed bird's eye view, but from the perspective of someone situated in one of the places that form a network in Central America and that were inhabited for tens of thousands of years before the present day. And this is the approach we took in the catalog or in the publication by emphasizing dwelling, connecting, authority, and spirituality as ways to think about specifically Central American approaches to being in place. Dwelling, starting with the practices of everyday life, how people got on with things, what life was like for someone living in the towns and villages that characterize the region. Connecting, looking at very important cosmopolitan and long-range connections that were forged, as well as how connection happened from village to village, town to town. Perhaps for archaeologists, the most difficult thing to come to terms with is the multiple and complex ways that authority was was framed in Central America. Archaeologists have historically been more accustomed to looking at one central authority and been more comfortable with those societies in which political, economic, and social authority was all concentrated in a few hands. And Central America challenges that kind of thought. Instead, we have to talk about different forms of authority. And finally, something that in general in archaeology in the 20th century we tended to be a little bit nervous about, but that's central to actually understanding any of the imagery and the material culture of Central America. We need to think about spirituality, about the ways that people in this region understood themselves in relation to supernatural beings and to ancestors. So if we start with dwelling, one of the things we need to acknowledge is that most of the people in Central America, before the Spanish arrived and colonized large parts of the area, lived in small villages. And our imagination of these small villages is greatly helped by the circumstances of one village, such village, Hoya de Seren, in El Salvador, which was covered in a volcanic eruption, preserving intact features that normally would disappear and that archaeologists wouldn't have access to. And Hoya de Seren becomes more and more important the more we learn about it, because what it's telling us is that even small rural villages contained great social complexity, that people lived with objects of great beauty in their everyday lives, and that in fact there were multiple forms of social authority, some of them exercised by men, some by women. So when we look at the map or plan, we actually see a series of clusters of houses and of buildings that actually had more special purposes. The map is normal for archaeological imagination of places, but what Seren allows us to see is the three-dimensional reality, because what was preserved here are structures made of clay used as a building material like adobe, and these structures were covered intact with various forms of objects that people had used. No humans were affected by this eruption, so this is not a Pompeii, although it's sometimes called America's Pompeii. The only things that died here were buildings, and buildings actually had lives in Central American thought. Now, I wanted to start with this particular structure because, as you see, the archaeologists working here have suggested that it may have been the place where a ritual specialist, quite possibly a woman, practiced divination for the community. And this raises the question that I think is essential to my talk, which is, how do archaeologists know things like this? How could we possibly say these kinds of things? And we normally don't tell you all of that. We normally don't go into the details. First of all, I put in possibly, because when we say these kinds of things, a ritual specialist who was a woman lived here, we tend to give them with much more authority than perhaps we should. But using the assemblage of tools that was found here, there were more tools of women's work in this place than was typical of the other buildings here. What are tools of women's work? Spindle whorls for weaving cotton and metates for grinding corn. So this is a space where the presence of women in women's work was concentrated. Why do we think that it might have been a space where there was a ritual practitioner, somebody doing divination? Well, you can see I have a pointer, so let's see if we can use it. You can see right here there's a interesting lattice work, and this is the only one of these preserved buildings that has a window that actually had a built-in lattice work. And the argument that's been made is that this was a space where someone inside could convey messages outside. And there are other details of the internal structure of the building that aren't like a normal house, that suggest that what was going on here were special kinds of activities. So we can start with a community that actually, well, it's a farming community, it's a rural community, was quite wealthy. And if we go back to the map, I want to point out some of the evidence of that kind of wealth. The fields themselves, with the plants in them, were preserved. So we know that this house, structure 4, was growing cacao, the source of chocolate, maguey, a source of fiber, guayaba, one of the wonderful fruits of the area, as well as milpas of corn. So when we look at these places, we have kitchen gardens. We have a sense that these were people who lived with a really rich and complex diet and rich and complex access to things that we often talk about as wealth, such as chocolate. The community structures at Suresnes include sweat baths, places that were probably sites where members of the community gathered together, as sweat lodges work in North America, perhaps for ritual purposes, but certainly ways for people to coordinate their disputes without having to have a central authority come in and settle them. So these kinds of villages we want to think about as having their own village-level identities, their own village-level authorities based on such things as ritual performance, but also their own ways to negotiate disputes that might have happened. Now, I said that Hoya de Suresnes is unusual. Normally, we don't find buildings like this intact to this extent, including evidence of the thatched roofs, which allowed Payson Sheets, the excavator of these buildings, to say that sharp volcanic glass tools were stored by being stuck in the thatch of the roof, perhaps as a way to keep children and people from cutting themselves in everyday life. That's simply not what we normally find. And the only reason we find it here is because there's layer after layer after layer of volcanic ash, of volcanic sediment that was deposited on top of these buildings. So we can imagine from remains like this that villages like this looked something like this. And this is a reconstruction done for Honduras' Alua Valley, where I work, of a small group of houses, each of the buildings clay, perhaps clay and pole, perhaps just clay blocks, as we learned from Suresnes, with thatched roofs, together facing out on an open working space. That's what we can imagine. But in most archaeological sites, if we're lucky, as here at Copan, we get stone platforms that once held the bases of now perished walls and the roof is completely gone, with exterior working spaces, and we can figure out how people got up to them. Much more common is something like this from Cerro Palenque, where the remains of the building walls, and probably the only stone that was used in these building walls, is a single line of stones on top of which the pole frame covered in clay would have been built. Something that we can draw as a ground plan, but it entirely lacks things we see at Suresnes: built-in shelves, the use of the roof beams for storage, things that are also described in indigenous stories, indigenous tales of life. All of that is gone, and what we're left with is the basic remains of the building. And it can be, in fact, as simple as one tiny segment of clay wall preserved through burning in an otherwise invisible landscape of clay. But even when none of the house walls are preserved, and that's what the dotted lines here mean, these are our supposed or expected or proposed edges of buildings. Even when none of those walls are preserved, archaeology, through scientific techniques, has learned to tease out the evidence of people's everyday lives, of their interaction with plants, for example, so that in this case, all the purple things are individual. Each purple dot is an individual ancient seed or piece of the shell of a plant, burned and preserved, so that we can see that there are places, hearths, for example, and we can actually identify from those burned pieces what kinds of plants were being processed there. Most of that hearth, most of the plant remains, were pieces of wood, which is understandable. Firewood used to burn to create the fire. But the second largest thing is remains of corn, so that we can say that the people living in these buildings, which are otherwise invisible, I'm not even bothering showing you pictures of them, because as a former director of the Honduran Institute of Anthropology once said to me, You archaeologists, you tell us these things and we just have to believe you, as I was pointing urgently at this very dirt and saying, these are some of the earliest houses known from Central America. But it's not invisible. People left traces behind. And the traces they left behind tell us that this was a cooking hearth. This was a place where food was being prepared. We can look at the edges, the very edges of the cut glass, the volcanic glass that was used as the main kitchen tool throughout all of these villages. Edges that we know would have been used to cut the kernels of corn off of corn cobs. And we can look to see what starches are still adhering to individual pieces of obsidian, pieces of volcanic glass, going back as much as 3,000 or 3,500 years ago. And in this case, looking at this one single piece yielded us evidence of yucca, manioc, of a grass, of an unidentified plant that's different from these. So that blade, that single tool, was used by someone in this kitchen at Los Naranjos to cut a manioc tuber up. Perhaps to do something with straw or grass to make a mat or to make other kinds of straw artifacts, and for at least one other plant. This isn't just telling us what plants are around, this is telling us about the individual gesture and the action of a person at the level of everyday practice. And this is what archaeology really can reveal. In my opinion, the most important thing we can reveal is what life was like for people on the ground. It's a thing that archaeologists know and that we've been far too slow to share because we think of it as very technical and very difficult to explain. So, going back to Suren, going back to villages like those at Suren, also included in the material that was preserved in place were beautiful and unexpectedly complex painted pots, the kind of things that were used to serve the food, we can tell was in these sites from the microscopic remains of seeds and from the microscopic remains of plant starches that last forever, apparently. And this is just a sample of 5 such painted bowls, all of them from sites in El Salvador, showing the richness of different ways of forming the same thing. One of the things that's been underappreciated about life in these kinds of villages that Central American archaeology repeatedly shows, and that's important for us to emphasize, is that these villages produced enough surplus, were wealthy enough, they were what I've called wealthy farmers, that they could support some members of the community becoming craft specialists and indeed artists of great distinction and great capacity. So much so that this is what everyday life looked at like, living in places surrounded by objects of beauty that were used in everyday meals. And objects that also, I should mention, probably are one of our best points of understanding of that aspect of spirituality, of what was important about the natural world, about the ancestral world, about narratives of how time began and humans' place in the world. So, if I begin by basically arguing that archaeology can reveal everyday life, then the story I have to tell about everyday life needs to be put in a broader context. So we can start with the house foundations. Each of these is one house, which together with other such units formed small villages. And in this case, in the area that I work in, we've mapped these villages along the water courses, and you can see that it looks like a fairly contemporary kind of settlement. The rivers were essentially the streets, and people were living all along them, taking advantage of the fertility of the land, of the accessibility of water, growing, again, in their house gardens, a number of plants that they used. In this area, growing many groves of cacao. This is an area that was known for chocolate when the 16th century sources by Europeans were first written. In this small area, an 800 square mile valley, we've located over 500 archaeological sites. So when you look across the landscape of Central America today, what you really need to realize is that on that same landscape are the traces of hundreds of thousands, probably of tens of thousands of villages from the past. And all the people who lived in those villages, their lives, are still partly there for us to begin to try to reach out and try to understand. But I don't want to leave you with the idea that there were only small rural farming villages, because there were also settlements that are somewhat larger and might have been places of different kinds of activities. And we can call those towns. And again, we can look at, in that same area I just showed you, there's a series of towns that we can identify that have some buildings that are fancier, some buildings that are larger, some people living in houses with more wealth, with things often gained from very far distances. But it would be a mistake to think about these towns and the territories around them like modern nations or states. We want to think about them instead as a town with its own identity and a hinterland full of villages where the villagers might come into the town on special occasions, for ceremonies, for rituals, to trade for things that they can't get locally. But they weren't necessarily controlled or bound by the people in the center. So if I was living here, I might go to Curuste, but I might just as well go to Rio Blanco. As a member of a village on the landscape, my choices were actually broader than in the modern notion of bounded states that we archaeologists have traditionally brought to this kind of archaeology. So what are these towns like? My own examples that I understand the best come from Honduras, where my own fieldwork has been. Curuste is one excellent example of one of these towns. And you can see that there's small house platforms around the margins, but that the main area is larger buildings and wide open spaces. And these larger buildings are what we've come to expect from studies in places like the site of Copan, but they're built with different technologies. Central America actually shows us a wide range of what these towns, these more central places, might look like. Aguas Buenas, Nicaragua, has a whole series of these round mounds, which you can see on the air photo and on the map, are arranged in circular patterns. Guayabo de Turrialba in Costa Rica exemplifies a place with round platforms, and here in this reconstruction drawing has been superimposed a series of round buildings with thatched roofs of a form that's known ethnographically to have been in use in these areas of Costa Rica and all the way through Central America. But also paved walkways, aqueducts, water features. These are very different. Towns are very different from place to place in Central America. The towns, in fact, from one town to another may be quite different in their layout and in the features that they include. But what they have in common is that they probably provided places where larger gatherings of people came together for the practice of ceremonies and rituals, some of them tied to the agricultural year, some of them possibly dictated by traditional histories of the actions of beings at the beginning of time, some of them tied to the life cycles of the people living in the towns and villages, their marriages, the births and maturity of their children, the commemoration of their death and of their transformation into ancestors. And one of the ways we begin to actually have an idea of what happened in these kinds of rituals are the images painted on pots like this one, which shows from Honduras, which shows two people holding maracas or rattles and another ritual implement in movement, the kind of movement we think of as dance, ritual dance. Movement basically on these sorts of things. If their knees are bent or their feet are off the ground, we think of them as in motion. So one of the means we have is certainly from the artworks themselves, but archaeology provides a second mechanism, and the two work together. And that second mechanism that archaeology provides when we find sites that have not been disturbed by looting is to begin to figure out where people used these extraordinary things that were signified as ritual objects. And here from Curuste, we have a ceramic sculpture of a woman. If you can see this, each of these bars is 20 centimeters, so that is a meter. This is it's a short woman. It's actually effectively life-size. She's shown, most observers agree that she's shown pregnant, and she has on her back a backpack which is not attached by the conservators yet, but you can see the edge of some of the ropes and the rest of the rope coming over her shoulder. So she's dressed for ritual practice. She's a woman who we can say was either an ancestress or a ritual participant, possibly a ritual leader. And one of the things we find over and over in Central America is that women are as prominent as men in the images that get commemorated and published by ancient people. In this case, this sculpture from Curuste was actually excavated. After it was used, it was broken into pieces by the people who used it and ritually deposited, covered up. And so you can see that's actually the bottom of it. That's actually one of her feet. She has feet. They're not attached yet in this photograph. And here you can see another pair of feet. These are jaguar feet, not her feet. So there were multiple examples of this kind of sculpture that stood at this point in Curuste's open spaces during a particular event. These kinds of large-scale sculptures are rare, but are known in every large collection. Here from the National Museum of the American Indian, from a site today called Naranjo Chino, we can see a figure who we think is masculine, holding an axe, the blade here tied and through an axe handle. Each of these sculptures that we've looked at is unique. Each is showing us a person in a role important to their community, a role important enough to be commemorated in one of the largest pieces of ceramic sculpture known from Central America, and I think it's fair to say from the Americas. Another site where these have been professionally excavated, in this case by students working with me, is called Montecales. And here you can see how all of these sculptures originally stood on these vessel lids. Notice the sandals, which the woman that I showed you first also has. Wearing sandals is one of the distinctive traits of authorities in at least northern Central America. This particular figure once held in his hand, suspended, a small ceramic bag, an effigy of the kind of bag that pellets of resin burned in ritual were kept in during actual ceremonies. Montecales itself is located in that same river valley I showed you earlier, the Ulúa River Valley. It's a small rural site. It has a total of 4 platforms. The other 2 are over here, so I cut them off, with individual buildings on them. So it's a rural village, not even a town. And this is actually the site itself. I'm sure you can all see the platforms there, right? No. It's traditional for archaeologists to say you can't see it here, but you can see it here. There's one, and there's the other. Okay? So these are villagers. And over a course of at least 200 years, and quite possibly as much as 300 years, they returned over and over to this one area where eventually they built a stone-walled chamber in which they disposed of the broken pieces of incense-burning vessels. Layer after layer, we carefully excavated them, mapping every single fragment so that we could arrive at an understanding. You can see a lid with an almost complete jaguar, the head missing. The head is not there. The head we think was taken away somewhere else as a reminder, a recuerdo of this particular event. And long handheld handles for individual incense-burning vessels to be held by participants. In addition to the large number of human figures in this medium, we have a repeated representation of an animal that we have every reason to think was a feline, perhaps a jaguar. And felines become another of the indicators of positions of authority, but positions of authority that seem to be heavily related to ritual practice, and quite possibly to these kinds of rituals through which people may have been communicating with their ancestors, specific to their place, specific to their town, specific to their village. So, when we begin to actually look at the combination of the imagery on pots and what archaeologists find in the ground, usually broken and discarded, but still the implements that people used in their everyday life, we find that throughout this area, a number of things were activities done in ceremonial and ritual contexts. Burning of resin is repeatedly done throughout this area. Dances of various kinds, and this is another dancer with his legs bent, holding different poles, one with a flap staff, which for those of you in the Maya Society will recognize this as a version of the flap staff dance. Such ritual specialists are shown repeatedly on the painted pottery from Honduras, where I work, holding musical instruments. And often they're observed by another figure seated in a raised area, in this case inside of a building. Oh, sorry, I skipped one. There it is. Or just seated on a raised throne or seat. Another of the ways repeatedly throughout this region authorities are indicated is that some people sit on elevated seats. And the degree to which they're raised off the ground can be very subtle. It can be as simple as a mat. Again, archaeologically, we find objects like this, primarily in Panama, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua, made locally, that are sometimes described as metates, but are clearly used as benches, as this figurine shows with the bench with cat heads that it sits on. Benches like these, in fact, have a continuing history, ethnographically and historically, used in much of this area by ritual practitioners, people that we sometimes group together globally with other ritual practitioners and call shamans, people whose ability to pass between this world and the world of supernatural beings and ancestors gave them local authority, not as rulers, but as the people who could solve many problems, including illness of the individual and sickness that afflicted the whole community. And such objects made in Central America, made in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, this one, moved widely throughout the area. And this one ended up in Honduras, and similar examples are pictured on pottery from the same site, Tenampua, as seats of authority, showing us that the idea that these were important markers of authority was something that was shared internationally by a cosmopolitan group of people, not a single nation, not a single linguistic group, not a single ethnicity, but a network of people who interacted with each other intensively and shared an understanding of where authority came from and how to mark it. And this becomes quite complex. So you have a mat motif, again a form of seating, and a jaguar combined repeatedly on pottery from Honduras, and emulated in Costa Rica and in a locally made form, a vessel of which ended up moving back to Honduras and ending its life here at the National Museum of the American Indian. So these complex shared understandings were embodied locally by different craft workers, and then the objects of their craft working were themselves transmitted from one group of people to another, from one town to another. Probably best to think of this from one wealthy family with local stature to another. And it isn't just things that we might think of as objects of and I'm a ceramicist, so I'm going to say something I don't believe, relatively unskilled workers. If any of you have ever tried to make a beautiful pot painted that way, you will know that that's not an unskilled worker at work. But we have objects that were made by even fewer incredibly skilled workers. The Ulúa marble vases in Honduras being an excellent example, studied by Christina Luke, who will be on our program this afternoon, who has been able to establish that these objects, whether found in Costa Rica or in Uashaktun or other sites in the Maya lowlands, were probably made in one or a few workshops at a specific site called Travessia. Items of luxury, items made by craft workers who were freed to develop these incredibly complex skills by small towns, by networks of farmers, without gross differences in economic status, without high levels of economic inequality, and appreciated by a cosmopolitan population that spread from at least as far as Guatemala to at least as far as Costa Rica. And things didn't move just from one center. I'm not privileging the Honduran Ulúa Valley and Ulúa culture that I happen to know very well. We find, in fact, along with one such vessel in the Ulúa Valley, an object of gold alloy, the kind of objects that were made at the same time in Panama and Costa Rica, moving up as far north as Chichen Itza, again in the Yucatan Peninsula, at its time the largest and most powerful Maya site in the Maya lowlands. Objects of jade, a material from the Motagua River Valley in Guatemala, were found throughout the same area, and different local traditions of carving jades produced objects that moved, again, south and north from the makers throughout a cosmopolitan population that shared artistic preferences and desires. How were these connections forged? We can look at travel. And many of the painted pots, this one from the Quiche Department of Guatemala, show us scenes of traveling. In this case, a very distinguished person being carried on a litter by other people. So travel itself becomes one of the themes that's commemorated. So we can think about people traveling from one of these areas to another. And again, historically, people in Panama describe long-distance visits to other areas in South America, in particular, in search of knowledge, esoteric knowledge. We can also think about social relations crafted through marriages. This particular figurine, again from the NMAI collection, is one of a whole series found in different sites in Honduras that probably commemorate very specific marriages between sites as distant as Copan and Tenampua in the case of this one from Copan. And if you want more details for that, Material Relations, my book with Julia Hendon and Jeannie LePipero, is all about that and is appearing this fall. And finally, I need to mention the kind of authority that often is overrepresented in archaeological accounts: violent authority, authority through military conquest. This does appear commemorated in Central American materials. But we do wrong and an injustice and misrepresent people in the past when we take these kinds of things and represent them as the main form of politics, the main form of interaction. And we probably need to look at things like the use of this spear by, again, a figure on a Honduran pot, which only appears very late, around 900 AD, plus or 850 to 950 AD. We probably need to look at these things for their symbolic nature, not just for their pragmatic nature, not as evidence of conquest or conquest alone, but as related to other metaphors of capturing vitality, fertility, and resources. So, I hope that in this talk, I've been able to give you an idea of how things varied in Central America, but also some commonalities, and in particular to begin to get you thinking about how archaeologists can reveal things not about big states or the very large scale, but about life on the ground. Life on the ground in Central America in the period before the 16th century is something that has been underreported. I again want to thank the National Museum of the American Indian for the effort taken to make this public exhibition about this area that is so important to us, as it gives us alternative ways of thinking about the past, where people were able to engage in highly beautiful craft work and long distance connections, and perhaps not through those means enter into such very unequal social relations as we normally talk about as archaeologists. Thank you.